Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this International Affairs webinar on innovations in EU foreign policy. I'm Pepijn Bergsen. I'm a research fellow in the Europe program at Chatham House, and I'm lucky enough to chair today's event. This event is part of the International Affairs webinar series and draws on research published in the May 2021 issue of the journal. As I said, we're going to be discussing EU foreign policy and in particular some innovations within that. Quite a lot has been happening in that in recent years. The EU, and in particular the European Commission, increasingly talk itself up as a foreign policy player. Just think of the current Commission under President von der Leyen branding itself as a geopolitical commission. And more broadly, we've seen quite a lot of developments in EU foreign policy and how it's implemented. Not least the establishment, of course, of an EU diplomatic service, the External Action Service, only just over a decade ago, which we will be talking about quite a lot today. As one of our panelists calls it in her article in International Affairs, it's a contested organization in EU foreign policy. So I think we'll have quite a lot to talk about. And we'll be talking about how its role has evolved and some of the policy innovations within that as well. Two specifically innovations we'll be talking about, which our two panelists have written interesting papers in the latest edition of International Affairs, specifically the External Action Service's efforts to combat online disinformation and the previous High Representative's policy entrepreneurship in getting a new EU global strategy off the ground in 2016. On the way in this discussion, I hope we'll also be able to discuss more of recent developments in EU foreign policy and look ahead a bit in terms of what we can expect in that regard. Which just leads me to introduce our two speakers. We have Elsa Hedling. I'm very sorry for mispronouncing your name almost certainly, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Political Science at Lund University. And we're joined also by Monika Sus, who's an associate professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences and a fellow at the Center for International Security at the Hertie School. Just to let everybody know, this webinar will be recorded and is on the record, so feel free to live tweet anything you hear today. We will start with opening remarks from our two speakers, after which we will dive into this discussion in which I'd love to get everybody involved. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to start asking questions as soon as possible for our panelists and hopefully get everybody involved in the discussion. With that, I will give the floor to Elsa, who will start with her opening remarks.
Thank you, Pepijn, and thank you to the International Affairs team and Chatham House for inviting me to this webinar and this conversation on innovations in EU foreign policy. Both of our articles look at a past period of transformation and innovation, but I think it's safe to say that we are again in a time period when we're seeing windows of opportunity and to some extent also individual and organizational entrepreneurship that can drive change in EU foreign policy, and not least now in relation to the pandemic. So this seems like a very timely subject and perhaps also a sign of coming of age in relation to the European External Action Service. After a decade has passed, we can now see some patterns of innovation that this new diplomatic service and its leadership has enabled. My article is based on a study that I conducted over several years when I followed the development of the European External Action Service capacity to engage in efforts of countering digital disinformation. And this began in 2015 when the Council tasked the High Representative and the External Action Service with coming up with a response to Russian disinformation that by then had become identified by the member states as a growing concern. Now, in 2015, this was still a controversial area. Some member states were very concerned about the risk of being perceived to be engaging in counter propaganda. And the resulting action plan led to the creation of a special unit within the External Action Service, the East StratCom Task Force. And my study looked at how this unit introduced change in diplomacy, in EU diplomacy, specifically through experimentation within the External Action Service. So I look at changes at the practical level, and that means the working routines, the techniques, the logics and habits by the officials in the European External Action Service, both within this task force and also among the officials that in different capacities engaged in EU strategic communication during this time. So also how these practices spread beyond the task force. And to analyze innovation and practices, I engaged with international practice theory that allows me to focus the analysis on the interplay of reflexivity and practical change. And I draw on interviews that I conducted, 23 interviews that I conducted with members of the East Stratcom task force, but also with diplomats that in different ways had insights into the creation and the development of the task force. And my findings suggest that the mandate for countering digital disinformation reflects change beyond the initial purpose by fostering a new communications culture within the External Action Service through new actors, most notably journalists and communicators, that brought new and different perspectives than those of the Brussels officials and member state diplomats. And these new actors introduced new communication practices that are interesting because they resulted from experimentation, specifically more active efforts of myth busting and positive narrative projection. And what is perhaps striking is also how fast this group and these new practices, these counter practices, became accepted within the European External Action Service. And all this led to a gradual reorientation of audience perception in EU public diplomacy, which of course also coincided with major political events such as Brexit. That also led the External Action Service to engage more in efforts of re-engaging the EU public. But this has since also continued to be a central issue area, not least in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. Efforts to counter COVID-related disinformation in the member states have sometimes turned to the East or referred to the East Stratcom Task Force as a sort of lighthouse initiative within the EU. And finally, to relate these findings to the sort of overarching role of innovation in EU foreign policy, I think that this is perhaps an interesting illustration of how adaptations and experimentation in response to external shocks, such as disinformation or say pandemics, or like in Monika's article where you talk about internal shocks such as Brexit, are ways of moving beyond the underlying contestations in common EU foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting, and in particular, sort of also the link with the current situation and countering disinformation around COVID. Monika, would you like to take the floor now?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really thrilled that I can discuss my research with you today. I will start with presenting you the point of departure for my paper that has been published in the International Affairs in the recent issue. And the point of departure was to some extent constituted by a puzzle that I somehow came up with. And the puzzle is the following. On one hand, the dominant view in the literature is that the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy is a constrained agent of the member states. And the incumbents of this office have limited possibilities for leaving their own footprint on the decision-making process because the formal condition for their action lies in the mandate conferred by the member states. So in other words, there are legal and political constraints for the activities of HRBPs that limit the room for maneuver or discretion. On the other hand, however, experts have attributed the key role in facilitating the recent progress that happened since, let's say, 2016 in security and defense and which was portrayed as the most far-reaching and unprecedented since the creation of common foreign and security policy, precisely to Federica Mogherini, who acted as the High Representative between 2014 and 2019. By progress, I understand the launch of 4 initiatives such as PESCO, so Permanent Structured Cooperation, European Defence Fund, Coordinated Annual Review of Defence, and a couple of others. And it was Mogherini who in 2016 came up with the EU global strategy that served as a framework for these partly intergovernmental and partly supranational initiatives that I just mentioned. And the EU global strategy, just to give you an illustration of how important this document has been perceived by experts and policymakers, has been described as an umbrella for further integration within this policy area, as, again, a quotation, most encompassing set of political guidelines for the EU external action, or as a vehicle for which further developments in this field circulated. So as we can see, a pretty powerful document has been put forward by Mogherini. And it puzzled me that someone with such limited power as the HRVP, according to the existing scholarship at least, could determine political change to such a great extent. And hence the goal of my paper was to somehow advance the understanding of the power and influence of the HRVP by looking at the political practice within a single case study, and that has been already mentioned, so the drafting and the early months of the implementation of the global strategy. Before I move on to some insights from the case study, let me very briefly refer to the framework that I chose to conceptualize the role of the HRVP. And since I was interested in particular in the agency of the incumbent of this office, I decided to draw on the multiple streams approach developed by an American scholar, John Kingdom, to study policy change in the US in conditions of high ambiguity and complexity of actors, topics, structures. And these are features that without any doubt characterize EU foreign and security policy. And this approach has been previously applied to the EU decision-making by some scholars, however, not to the EU foreign and security policy, at least not in a comprehensive way. And in a nutshell, this approach assumes the existence of 5 elements. There are 3 streams: problems, politics, and policy. There's a window of opportunity as the, let's say, fortunate political constellation for policy change. However, for a change to happen, there has to be the 5th element of this framework, and this is a policy entrepreneur who couples the streams together during a window of opportunity and pushes for policy change by developing proposals, committing resources, and deploying various strategies that I will talk about in a minute. And looking at the HRVP through the lens of this approach and considering the office holder, in my case, Federica Mogherini, as policy entrepreneur, enabled me the investigation of her agency and impact on policy change within the existing constraints that are, of course, legally binding by the Lisbon Treaty, for example. And by doing so, I hoped to open up a more fruitful research direction regarding the role of this office and of the person occupying this office than the concept of the constraints agent that is, as I said, the dominant view in the literature. Moving on to the case study, as I said, I focused on the drafting and the beginning of the implementation of the EU global strategy because the implementation is, of course, ongoing. And the process I focused on lasted between November 2014 and December 2016, so nearly 2 years. I traced Mogherini's footprint in the process of achieving progress, let's say, by finding observable evidence for the deployment of entrepreneurial strategies and manifestations of skills that are typically attributed to an entrepreneur. I would say I will focus now on the entrepreneurial strategies because they turned out to play a crucial role in influencing policy change in case of Mogherini. And I looked for evidence of 3 strategies that are most widely recognized in the literature. And these are framing problems and arousing interest. It is mostly about providing a narrative by developing frames that point to a particular dimension of the problem. The second strategy that Mogherini used was venue shopping. It means strategically selecting and or creating new settings to increase the chance of gaining support for a proposed solution. And finally, the third strategy, also applied widely by Mogherini, was mobilizing support by creating teams and coalitions that endorse policy proposals of a policy entrepreneur. And of course, the recent progress in security and defense did not happen in a vacuum, and it was already mentioned before. There was a window of opportunity that opened in the problem stream, for example, by the deteriorating security environment within the EU and beyond the EU, and the growing demand for stronger EU capacity to act within security and defense, and of course by some focusing events, as Kingdom called them, that is, for example, the Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, or the terrorist attacks in Paris in 2015. And in the politics stream, in turn, so in the broader environment around the policy making process, there was a positive mood towards more integration within security and defense, and there was a high public support for, once again, more integration in this respect. Mogherini, appointed in November 2016 to High Representative, embarked on the process of coupling, so of bringing these streams together and pushing for policy change. And the case study that I present in the paper shown that by applying all of these three entrepreneurial strategies, she was able to indeed leave her footprint on the policy change, despite the legal and political constraints of her office. And it confirmed the causal relationship between HRZP entrepreneurship and her or his impact on policy change, indeed. Her strategies differ across respective parts of the process, with the first strategy, framing and arousing interest, being most prominent in the first part of the process during securing the mandate for the strategy. And also it played an essential role during the implementation of the EU global strategy, while venue shopping and mobilizing support were most prominent during the drafting of the strategic document. But overall, the evidence that I found confirmed the presence of all three strategies and various techniques that can be somehow ascribed to them. And in exercising entrepreneurship, this is maybe one thing that we can also talk about that later in the discussion. Mogherini benefited from her interinstitutional position and was able to control the process and to present ideas. For example, one example of the framing strategy is that ideas coming from other stakeholders, like the Franco-German proposal for PESCO or the European Defence Fund designed by the European Commission, have been presented by Mogherini as the implementation package of the global strategy. So this is one of the examples of her successful entrepreneurship, indeed. And let me be clear, the instruments that I talked about and while talking about policy change within security and defense, so PESCO, European Defence Fund or CARD, have been actually floating around in the policy stream since at least 2013, but none of the stakeholders coupled them all together and coupled them with the problems and with the politics stream, and used the window of opportunity that presented itself in 2014-15 and pushed for policy change. So it took Mogherini, acting as an entrepreneur, to draw together the various ideas and streams and to push for progress. And of course, she was not the only entrepreneur that contributed to this policy change, but maybe we can also talk about it in the discussion. And let me conclude with, I'd say, three very brief observations that maybe will also provide some food for thought for the discussion. So first of all, policy entrepreneurship allows supranational agents to leave their footprint on policy change despite this limited formal powers. And this insight, I argue in the paper, can be applied to investigate other supranational agents, such office holders of the UN Secretary General or the NATO Secretary General. Of course, there are obvious differences between these posts and the office of the HRVP, but all three positions share one characteristic. Their office holders act as supranational agents, but they all depend upon an intergovernmental system for their mandates. So I'd say that this research provides or can provide an analytical lens that can be used to examine the role of other supranational policy entrepreneurs in the intergovernmental settings. The second observation is the one that I already mentioned. It's about the interinstitutional position of the HRVP that, in fact, as my case study has shown, facilitated Mogherini's entrepreneurship and allowed her to remain in the middle of the policymaking process. She very consciously used the roles of Commission's Vice President and as the chair of the Foreign Affairs Council, and remained in the middle of the process from the beginning throughout the implementation. And more theoretically, And I also mentioned this before, I would argue that the multiple streams approach offers tool to account for agency of single and multiple entrepreneurs. And there are many entrepreneurs within EU foreign security policy, obviously, intergovernmental, supranational, and they also can be competitive to each other. So I would say that their interactions and impact on policy change offer further venue for research in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, quite a lot to discuss, I think, in the next, well, what do we have, 40 minutes. Before I open it up to questions from the audience, and I would again sort of ask everyone to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I just wanted to dive into something that we'd been discussing before this webinar, in that I read both your papers, and one of the impressions I got from that was that it actually painted quite a positive picture of the External Action Service. So Elsa, you talk about how their work on countering disinformation was successful in terms of the acceptance within the institution, and you mentioned today that it's now sort of found a sort of second life in the work that they're doing around COVID disinformation. Monika, you of course talk about how the High Rep was successful in putting forward a new EU strategy, and I saw that as quite positive. And then I mentioned that in an email to you, and you both responded to me with something along the lines of, "Well, that might be a bit strong." And that seemed more fitting with most of the commentary that you see about the External Action Service and sort of how it's been operating over the last decade. So yeah, I was wondering if either of you wanted to comment on that, and sort of, was I getting the wrong picture, or is it actually the case that a lot of the criticism over the last, well, I guess, decade has been correct? And this was just or these were two flash in the pans of a contested institution, as I think one of you called it.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that all depends on how you focus your discussion. Of course, what do you mean by positive? And I think for me, the purpose of my study and the purpose of my research is never really to determine if the External Action Service is doing positive things or not, but rather to look at what is actually happening, what is taking place, and what does that mean in practice. But I do also understand what you mean, and I think that a lot of research, and not just research, just a commentary on the European External Action Service has focused on quite different questions than the ones that we do in both of our articles. So if looking at that, then I think definitely, I mean, we do see that the External Action Service is amounting to something. There are things happening, there are innovations and change stemming from this new organization and this new mandate that they also have in the broad architecture of EU foreign policy. So yes, I agree with you in that way, that this is perhaps a more positive approach to look at and to assess the role of the European External Action Service in EU foreign policy.
Maybe I should have said not critical instead of positive. Monika, sorry.
Yeah, I agree with Elsa, and I also I had the same approach in my research. So it wasn't about providing a normative answer whether the high representative is powerful or not, but really about going more into depth in assessing the role of this person. Because I agree with you, there is this common view also, not only in the literature that I just mentioned to you, but also in the press, and that HRVP really cannot do much, right? So being very constrained by different difficulties, both legal, but also political and practical. And this is all true. But at the same time, I think we have to look on the EU foreign policy in a bit more differentiated way. So it's really easy to say there is not much going on, or these institutions or these office holders are not powerful enough. This is true to some extent. And as we all know, the reason for that is actually all over the same, right? So the decision-making power within this policy area lies with the member states. So only if the member states really want to, move forward, they will do it. And at the same time, I think the EU global strategy and the example of Mogherini actually, at least for me, it was an example of maybe not of a change through a backdoor, because it will be pretty strong to say that or to argue that, but still, for many member states, and I talked with many of the representatives of the member states for the sake of this article, they actually told me that in the very beginning, nobody really believed that the global strategy will be published and that it will be so successful and so powerful to some extent. And this limited belief of the member states was to some extent used by the High Representative to move forward. And again, I think by this position, by assessing this position, the key is the interinstitutional interplay that this position actually enables. And I think it will be also, good to look more into that.
Thank you. Yeah, just to sort of to follow up slightly on the ability of particularly, I guess, the High Representatives to sort of to shape policy through entrepreneurial, through policy entrepreneurship. One of the first questions that we got just now was from Nikolai Piplia. Sorry, I'm so sorry for butchering your name. Piplia. Well, from Nikolaus. I'm so sorry about that. And asking about the Borrell visit to Russia earlier this year, and what that brought forward, I think, was a lot of the same criticism that we've heard of EU foreign policy making and of the institution of the High Representative, in that it sort of doesn't have really the power to act by itself, and so it gets put into very difficult positions like the one that we saw in Russia. So I wonder if you see sort of any opportunities for the players themselves to do much about this, or is it really sort of that the space is mainly internal in terms of policy making and less so within really external or foreign policy, actually?
Shall I start, Elsa? Is it okay with you? Okay. Yes, I mean, my assessment of Borrell's visit to Moscow is entirely negative, and I think there's not much to talk about that. It was not a good visit without any positive outcomes. And I mean, from my perspective, it was a clear geopolitical mistake. And it really showed the weakness of this arguably geopolitical commission von der Leyen referred to when she was appointed to the president of the commission. And still, I believe it was a personal mistake of Borrell because the visit was not prepared, as we know, and we actually learned about that, I think, rather after his visit, that some of the member states were, of course, very negative towards the idea of him going to Moscow, but also the European Parliament was not entirely convinced that this visit should take place. And I think there were several articles in the press, in the European press, that really it could have been prepared in a much better way. And then maybe Borrell could really achieve something and not put the EU in a very awkward position. And of course, I mean, I agree with you, there are and there will be, and this is not something that I somehow dispute in the paper, the legal and the political constraints to this office, they are there, right? So we don't dispute that. But still, I think that within these constraints, the High Rep is actually able, if, again, there are some favorable moments in the politics stream and problem stream, to push for change. But again, the Borrell's visit to Russia was not an example of successful entrepreneurship to any extent. Thank you.
Yes, I think everybody agrees on that, and probably Borrell himself as well. Elsa, did you want to come in on that as well, or shall we move on?
No, just perhaps a general reflection. I think it's interesting that we've had such different leadership characters in the role of the High Representative so far. So it's also it will be interesting some years from now to be able to also analyze their different leadership in relation to, of course, the very different sets of challenges that they have faced.
Yes, yeah. If your papers are anything to go by, that would be really interesting to hear about. So the differences that specific people, and I guess sort of parts of the institution make. Speaking of that, we've had quite several questions about sort of the External Action Service's efforts to combat disinformation. One asking how other institutions, so how the OECD and the OSCE have responded to that. And we also have a question, someone asking, sorry, there's slightly too much now and I can't find everything, whether this innovation has improved the public role in the EU foreign policy process. So I'm quite interested to hear your thoughts on both of those.
Right. Well, I mean, in general, I think it's very interesting that how this initiative and some of the initiatives that followed this initiative, because I have to stress that this is only one part of the activities that the EU is now undertaking in this area. This has now become very much integrated into the more general framework for digital policy and finding ways of managing in this new digital society that we live in. But I think what is interesting is that this has positioned the EU and the European External Action Service specifically as an organization that was quite early in adapting to this challenge and finding ways to work with it. So I would say that in general, the response from other organizations has been quite positive, and the External Action Service has been invited to discuss with other organizations. And like I said, also in my opening statement there, it's regarded as a sort of lighthouse initiative. So that is interesting, because when you think about it, it's not necessarily evidence that this was a role that the European External Action Service would fill. Then again, countering disinformation can also be controversial in more areas than just in terms of counter propaganda. There's also a tension with freedom of expression. So there's been there's been criticism also directed towards the European External Action Service, not least in the Netherlands, that you might know well about. In terms of a more public role for the European External Action Service, yes, I think it has resulted in a more public role. I think, like I said, the communications culture has changed as a result of this period of experimenting with new practices of communication. And I think if you look at different types of communication campaigns that are coming out of the European External Action Service today compared with a couple of years ago, you can see a change. And I think that change in part reflects this organizational development, but I think it also reflects a more general sense of learning more about how to navigate and how to communicate in a digital environment.
That's really interesting, and I think sort of in the article, talk about that quite a lot in terms of learning how to engage with the public, which as someone who spent some time in the foreign ministry, was really interesting to read. We've gotten quite a few questions sort of on wider EU foreign policy, but I'd like to slightly stick to the External Action Service for now, and maybe try to be a bit nicer about the new High Rep, given that we've only been critical of him so far. So one of the questions from Valentina Romanova is whether the speakers would like to share their first impressions regarding the innovations in EU foreign policy under the new High Representative, apart from tackling COVID-19, of course. So is there anything that you're seeing that's already happening, or that's happening right now, that we could compare in some way to the to the developments that you mentioned in your papers, which are of course both a few years back.
Okay, I will start on this question. Very interesting one indeed. And I would say that there are, okay, so let me start with saying that the circumstances for Borrell to get active are of course extremely difficult, right? And for the overall commission, we have the pandemics, or we have the pandemics, and we will actually start fighting the repercussions of the pandemics right now, right? And it will take us a couple of years at least, if not decades, to somehow fight with the social and economic repercussions of the pandemic. And we saw, of course, or we are witnessing it all the time, what was the impact, or what is the impact of the pandemic on EU external service or EU foreign policy in general. For example, the cuts in the budgets, right? This is one of the first and I think foremost examples of how the EU foreign policy actually definitely not benefited from the COVID-19 crisis. But having said that, I would say that Borrell, I would mention, I think, two things that I think could be somehow positive in the future. The one thing is that he, I think already during his hearing for the European Parliament, shortly before he was appointed to the High Rep, he already mentioned the qualified majority voting. So the introduction of the qualified majority voting into at least some areas of EU foreign and defense, foreign security policy. And I think, again, a very controversial topic, of course, highly debated in some member states. A lot of member states don't want to move into this direction, but again, he's persistent on that, and he has strong support from France, Germany, and not only, also from some smaller states, because it will be easier for the bigger member states to accept that. So this is the first thing that I think he embarked upon pretty early. And with some luck, he might get successful by the end of his term to push through this. Of course, not in every area of EU foreign and security policy, but at least in some, as for example, the introduction of sanctions. This is actually on the table. And the second thing that I would like to mention that is really interesting and going on right now is the process of the strategic compass. And this is something that I am studying right now with the framework of the multiple streams approach and with the framework of several competing entrepreneurs, because the strategic compass is not as the European global strategy and not developed by the High Rep and by the External Action Service, but it has been initiated by the German Council presidency, and it will be presented during the French presidency of the Council. So it is very much in the hands of the member states. But they do this, of course, in a close cooperation with Borrell and with the External Action Service, because the External Action Service holds the pen, and drafts the document. And I think it could be really interesting innovation to look at in 1.5 years, I think. And it could provide the necessary implementation of the EU global strategy to take the implementation forward. So I would focus on these two innovations.
Elsa, are you seeing any others that you think we should be aware of?
I mean, I think I'm still, first of all, it's very difficult to assess Borrell's job, I think, in not taking into account the COVID-19 pandemic, because that's obviously been a huge challenge. But I think it's also, again, relevant to think about how the High Representative, since the inception of the European External Action Service, their leaderships have been charged with very different challenges, and I think that is also perhaps how we should assess them. In some ways, I think Catherine Ashton was charged with setting up the European External Action Service. That was very much what her challenges were about, whereas Mogherini came into leadership in a period that I think Monika describes very well here, where there was opportunities to bring in new innovation and find new ways of doing things in this new service. And I think to some extent, maybe what Borrell's challenge will be is also to try to find ways of consolidating the European External Action Service, consolidating these practices, finding out what works, what doesn't work, what do we need to redo. So, and in some ways, I think also COVID-19 is a very good test for these practices that are actually in place in the European External Action Service. And I think we will need to give it a bit more time before we assess that. But in general, I would say that, yes, some things have not been working, but there are other things that have actually been working rather well. So I think that also goes to tell that there are things, even though things might look in disarray, there are things happening on the ground that are also working quite well. And those are the kind of discussions that we will need to have in the future in regards to Borrell's leadership.
If I just may add two fingers on this point of COVID and the budgets, because this is really important point that you just brought up, and I think that actually paradoxically the COVID-19 pandemic can provide a push for more integration in security and defense, right? Because the member states, they're already cutting budgets, and of course there is a let's say a big narrative in some of the EU countries to spend more on defense, and we also see the pressure coming from the Biden administration on Europe to push for more spending in defense. But on the other hand, it is not only the question of how much we spend, but how we spend the money. And there are a lot of studies across Europe how ineffectively the member states are spending their money on defense. And I think there is a consensus on the issue that a more coordinated spending or spendings across the EU member states will be profitable both for the security of national states, of member states, and of the overall EU security. So I think there might be also something positive that we will get of the pandemics, but I agree with Elsa, we have to wait before we assess anything. So it's too early to say, of course.
Yeah, I like that positive note. Not everything is going badly, and some good things might come of this terrible situation. That's always encouraging. To move on sort of to a slightly wider topic, we've mentioned sort of COVID-19 as sort of an external circumstance at the moment. And one of the questions which comes from Jos Leijten, which is a lot easier for me to pronounce, as I suspect he's a fellow Dutchman. And he asked about that over sort of the past 10 years of the External Action Service, we've had Trump, China, Russia, nationalism, populism force a really large change on the EU and on the External Action Service. And he's asking whether Europe would be able to design a more consistent strategy again for the next few years. And then we've seen others ask about this as well. And Nikolai Pipiviakas, apologies again, asked a very good question on whether the upcoming review of the treaties, although I think there won't be that much of a review of the treaties in the conference on the future of Europe, whether that is an opportunity to maybe do something about the way that EU foreign policy has been structured. So does either of you want to come in on that, on how to finally create a coherent EU foreign policy? I thought we'd ask the small questions right now. Would you like to come in, Monika?
Yeah. Okay. Look, I mean, the one question that this is the question that always appears, right, in the discussion on EU security and defense and foreign policy, and this is a very right question. But at the same time, I would like to remind everyone, and also I have to do it often to myself, that the EU is not a country, right? And if we talk about consistent strategy, it's really something different than, let's say, the security strategy of the United States or of Great Britain. I mean, we all know that even in a single state, nation state, how difficult it is to coordinate between ministries, between presidents, prime ministers, and different stakeholders. And on the EU level, it's a really huge challenge to get these things coordinated. And I'd say that, of course, the EU global strategy cannot be compared with a grand strategy of a single state, but this is the closest what we got so far. And if the member states, let's see, continue to see the need for more coordination in this respect, we might get the strategic compass as a document that will be even more concrete and more focused. And this could be something towards a consistent strategy that someone here referred to, but I wouldn't expect it to be, the one and single document. We have to remind ourselves that the EU foreign policy is extremely complex, both in terms of topics, in terms of stakeholders, and the expectations we have towards this have to be somehow adopted. So have to be different than for a single member state. But I think considering the progress that we made so far within the last, let's say, 5 years, we are on a way of doing this. But again, it all at the end comes to the willingness of the member states to come together. And this is the big question that still is in the room, of course.
That's very clear. Elsa, do you want to add anything on that?
No, just, I mean, I agree with Monika, and obviously EU foreign policy it's the member states. The member states drive EU foreign policy, so it will ultimately be up to what they decide and what they can agree on. And at times there may be more coherence, but at other times there will be less coherence. And again, that's the member states, but it's also the EU citizens. What the EU citizens in their respective member states, want their political leaders to do, and what they have a mandate to do in the context of EU foreign policy. So no, I don't think we can expect a coherent EU foreign policy anytime soon, the way things are looking at the moment. But that we might see more coherence in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because one of the things I noticed in both your papers is that you mention quite high public support for an EU foreign policy, and of course that's within polling, so it's always slightly vaguely phrased. What does that really mean? But what does that mean, do you think, for that? So does that make it more likely? Does that sort of create an opportunity to do that, or is it, as I said, sort of to a certain extent a polling artifact? Sorry, Elsa, as a follow-up to what you just said.
Sure. I mean, I think it also depends on the role of EU foreign policy in the member states, because that has also fluctuated. So as we see changes, changes in the transatlantic relationship, as we see changes in the security environment, yes, there might be more support for EU foreign policy in the member states, and that will ultimately also reflect the commitment that and the buy-in that the member states can offer common approaches and a more coherent strategy. But then again, I mean, public support is always something that fluctuates, and like you said, it's difficult to assess the polls. But I think you can sense that foreign policy has become more relevant in many of the EU member states in recent years.
Just briefly adding to that, if I may, yeah, it has become more relevant by all means, and I think one of the reasons for that is, of course, the perceived uncertainty of life, of security environments beyond Europe and in Europe itself. I mean, the terrorist attacks in Paris, for example, 2015, really provided a push for many member states to rethink their security dimension and the collaboration with other member states. So I think the public support is, of course, important. But on the other hand, I agree with Elsa, we shouldn't really overestimate it. And again, I think, if you have in mind the questions provided by the Eurobarometer on the support for common foreign and security policy, they're really general. And there are even questions to what extent the citizens of Europe support the idea of the European army. And I also think that the support for that is equally high, which could be, of course, optimistic. But then nobody asks really the citizens whether the support for the European army should mean that the national armies should cease to exist, right? So, therefore we have to be cautious when we talk about the public support. But I mean, of course, for policymakers, it could provide an impetus to move forward with this. I would be actually interested in a let's say poll regarding the qualified majority voting. I haven't seen that yet, so if someone have seen it, please mail it to me, because that could be interesting for the future.
Yes, if anybody's seen that, please CC me into that email as well. We have a very interesting question here, I think, and again, as a former foreign ministry employee, I would say that. But from Cornelia Navari, who asked that foreign officers everywhere have lost a part of their role in policy formulation to security services and special advisors. Shouldn't we be asking different questions about the role of foreign officers in the modern setting? And shouldn't we be considering the role of the European External Action Service in relation to the role and task of modern foreign officers? Do you have any views on that, either of you?
I mean, I think we should be a bit careful in comparing the European External Action Service with member state foreign services, because it's not a foreign service in that sense. It is still a pooling of member state diplomats and Brussels officials. They don't have the mandate to engage in policy formulation in that sense, in the way that foreign ministries, foreign services do. So I think I agree that question is very interesting, and that more research should look at that. But I am not quite sure that those questions are best directed to the European External Action Service.
Yes, agreed on that. And I think this is the same as, comparing the high rep to the foreign minister. It's also not good to do this, because then we easily can get disappointed. And on the other hand, if we actually look at this interinstitutional dimension that I referred to many times of this office, this is again something very particular for the EU. And on a positive note, also, let me just say that the interactions that actually are within the EU between the Commission, the External Action Service, and the member states, they can really provide something good in that. And the European Defence Fund would be an example of this, right? So when the European Commission really, for the very first time in the history of the European integration, pushed for more significant role in defence. Again, the COVID pandemic kicked in and caused cuts of the budget of the European Defence Fund, but it could be another step, not a first step, but another step towards more coordination between the institutions. And then maybe we could see more coherent policies whatsoever.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left, and quite a long list of questions still. So I think there's one that is quite interesting, also very specific strategies coming out of the EU, for instance, on the Indo-Pacific, which a few of the member states now have presented a strategy document, and the EU has now as well. And we've discussed sort of the coherence or lack of coherence of EU foreign policy. And this is an area on which the 27 member states have managed to come to a harmonized opinion, as it's described here. Do you have an idea why that did work and in other instances it didn't? Or is this just one where, because it's far away, it was easier to come to agreement?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, from my perspective, I'm not an expert on Indo-Pacific strategies. And yeah, I think I would rather say, as you just mentioned, it is not that, let's say, absolutely crucial for many of the member states, to deal with this region. As another point, or as an opposite to that, we have still a lack of coherent strategy towards China, right? Where the member states are not or cannot really agree on every and each point of the strategy. So, and I think, of course, China is a much more important player for many of the member states than the Indo-Pacific region. So yeah, this time probably easier to agree on. Not very optimistic, but yeah.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think the China example is a good one, also one that came by in the Q&A as one of the main challenges on which the EU clearly has not found agreement yet. One final one then, I guess, from an anonymous attendee, and that's on the. We've talked a bit about the sort of the interinstitutional dynamics, and the EEAS. Sorry, my screen is jumping all over the place. So do you see the Commission President and the Council President playing a more significant role in EU external action under the current Commission, and how might that affect the role of the High Representative and the External Action Service? I guess there have been some examples of this. Think of von der Leyen with Turkey. What does that mean that we have a more geopolitical Commission clearly engaged in what would be seen as foreign policy? What does that mean for the, I wouldn't say traditional foreign policy institutions, because they've only been around for 10 years, but the assigned institutions for foreign policy? Elsa, do you want to come in on that?
No, I mean, I will just say that the EU so far has developed a tradition of having multiple foreign policy leaders. So this is not necessarily something new. We've seen that in the past as well. And what is interesting is perhaps what determines who will get a more pronounced leadership role. I mean, in terms of Mogherini's leadership, that seemed to be something that she wanted for herself, and that she used the role to actively pursue. So I think that in some ways that will depend on personalities. There are different personalities, and they engage in leadership in different ways. So leadership personalities, but then of course also circumstances. I mean, I think probably what happened in Russia might also affect who we turn to look at for leadership. So the success and failures of these different, in some ways competing foreign policy leaders will also determine how they stand in comparison to each other.
Absolutely.
Monika.
And if I just may, try to end on the positive note, I think that the EU foreign security and defense policy is such a wide area, and there are so many things to do and so many areas to cover, that actually this multiple leadership, so the many leaders that Elsa just mentioned, it could be something positive, because we need division of labor, clearly, right? So the High Rep cannot really go to every possible foreign visit. And I think the division of labor between the President of the Commission, the President of the European Council, and the High Representative can be very beneficial, providing that they talk to each other and that they coordinate their activities with each other. And I think that's just to mention the example of Turkey, it was clearly a lack of coordination. So this is something that where definitely EU should act better and get to act better.
Thank you, and thank you for the positive note. And as I said, it's always nice to have a few of those, and particularly to end on. And thank you to Monika and Elsa for what I thought was a really interesting discussion, both on wider EU foreign policy and on the specific cases that you wrote about in your papers. Everybody can find the links to the papers in the chat below, which I think Zoom will automatically save for you once you log off. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you as well for all those questions. I'm really sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but there's so many left still. Thank you so much. We hope that you'll join us again for our next event, and again be as active. That will be an event on the 23rd of June, which will look at new trends in cyber and biological security. If you're subscribed to the International Affairs mailing list, you'll be sent an invitation near the time. So if you haven't done so yet, go to the website and sign up for that. And that just leaves me to thank our speakers again, and wish everybody a very good afternoon.